the CIA's Spy Cat, and 3 other secret animal weapons that almost won the Cold War. Cats wired for sound, bats carrying incendiaries, dolphins patrolling nuclear storage sites. One program actually delivered results, another accidentally torched a US base during testing. Budgets were classified, animals were treated as expendable, and officials could deny everything if it failed. Wartime desperation and Cold War paranoia opened doors to ideas that normally die in a meeting. In this story, we'll follow 4 core programs, what they tried to do, who pushed them, and what it cost, ethically and practically. To understand how we ended up with a cat whose tail doubled as an antenna, we need to go back. The pattern of desperation. Start with pressure. In World War II, the United States faced an industrialized grind where every advantage mattered. Cities burned, convoys sank, and commanders signed off on long-shot projects because small odds still beat zero. After 1945, the anxiety didn't end. It shifted. Nuclear weapons made the stakes existential and the timelines compressed. If you were in government then, what if wasn't idle talk, it was a mandate. The result was a pipeline that connected wartime labs to Cold War black budgets, where unconventional ideas, especially ones promising asymmetric results, got a hearing. Here's the structural reality that made animal projects possible. By the early 1940s, the US had a sprawling research infrastructure. The Office of Scientific Research and Development, Navy labs, Army proving grounds, university contracts, and a new class of defense contractors learning how to bid for secrecy. Compartmentalization meant only a handful of people saw the whole picture. If a program sounded odd but didn't cost much compared to ships or planes, it could live for years in the shadows. The payoffs, if they came, would be spectacular. The risks, public embarrassment, ethical scandal, were minimized by classification. There was precedent. Animals had been soldiers, tools long before electronics. Messenger pigeons in World War I carried notes across trenches and saved lives when radios jammed or lines were cut. Dogs ran medical supplies under fire. Horses hauled artillery. The idea wasn't new. It was the imagination that changed. If a pigeon could find its loft through smoke and chaos, what else could a trained animal do when paired with new technology? Inventors and scientists read that opening as an invitation. The cast included behaviorists who believed learning could be engineered, tinkerers who built prototypes in garages, and military officers whose careers rose or fell with the programs they championed. The pitch was always similar. Animals have abilities we can't replicate: echolocation, homing, agility, underwater endurance, so let's harness them. On paper, the logic held. In practice, biology pushed back. Meanwhile, budgets loosened. In the late war years, and then again in the 1950s and 1960s, Washington poured money into research that might deliver strategic edges: a better bomb sight, a quieter sub, a novel surveillance trick. Black programs sat inside classified budget lines with names nobody outside the circle recognized. Internally, managers kept proposals moving by framing them as low-cost gamble. A fleet carrier cost hundreds of millions. A pilot program with animals cost thousands to a few million. In that context, approving something strange looked prudent. What nobody knew at the time was how success in one domain could justify leaps in another. If pigeons could deliver reliable messages, then maybe pigeons could guide a bomb. If dolphins used echolocation to find fish, then maybe dolphins could find mines. Positive results in basic training sessions showed up in briefing slides, and the curve from works in a tank to works in a war zone looked smooth until reality intervened. But on the front end, optimism had its own momentum. Add the psychological layer. Bureaucracies reward novelty when fear is high. During the Cold War, intelligence failures were existential nightmares. Nobody wanted to be the officer who said no to a concept that might have foiled a submarine sabotage or cracked a spy ring. So proposals framed around, what if the enemy does this first, landed well. Animals offered plausible deniability too. If a device failed, a handler could retrieve it or it could simply disappear. If it worked, the victory could remain classified and claimed in quiet memos. There were early signals this pipeline would produce odd hybrids of biology and machinery. In the 1940s, a small community of behaviorists, led by B.F. Skinner, argued you could design environments to shape reliable behavior. At the same time, military engineering chased precision, guidance systems, timing mechanisms, new explosives. When those threads crossed, you got proposals like teach birds to steer a weapon or time an incendiary so a bat drops it inside a building. The fusion of living reflexes with mechanical triggers became a subgenre of R&D. Contractors learned the language that unlocked funds: low footprint, high effect. A bat with a matchbox-sized charge promised a citywide fire without a bomber fleet. A sea mammal could patrol a harbor without a constant human presence. Pigeons weighing ounces might rival bulky early electronics in visual recognition tasks. In white papers, these concepts looked elegant. Field conditions, though, are messy: wind, noise, predators, weather, and humans behaving unpredictably. Inside the agencies, compartmentalization shaped culture. A project manager could show a general or an admiral a carefully staged demonstration with hand-picked animals and a controlled setting. Success was visible. Failure stayed in lab notes and after-action reports stamped secret. Trainers who warned about limits were sometimes sidelined as insufficiently bold. Conversely, champions who believed, truly believed, in their animals fought to expand programs beyond what the animals could reliably do. There's also the moral fog. In wartime, the conversation about sentience and suffering took a back seat to results. Laboratory standards varied. Some handlers cared deeply for their animals and pushed for better housing and medical care. Others prioritized throughput and metrics. Veterinarians were involved, but oversight was thinned by modern standards. Because many of these efforts sat in classified compartments, external ethics review didn't happen, and internal dissent stayed off the record. The government's secrecy mechanisms amplified the pattern. Freedom of Information Act requests decades later would pry loose memos that revealed both the ambition and the absurdity, but during the peak years of experimentation, only tight circles knew what was happening. That allowed experimentation to iterate quickly, adjust a protocol, swap a device, try a new approach without public scrutiny. It also allowed sunk-cost thinking to take root. Once a program had its code name, its budget line, and its champions, ending it meant admitting failure to a small but influential set of peers. The time horizons mattered. World War II moved at a frantic pace. Concepts had months to prove themselves before the front shifted or a new weapon made them obsolete. The Cold War stretched for decades. Programs could rest in a promising, needs refinement status for years while leadership rotated. Promoters used every trick to keep attention, rebranding under a new acronym, moving a project from one service branch to another, or tying it to an emerging threat. And then there were the early wins or near wins that kept hope alive. Pigeons did perform strikingly well in controlled tests guiding a projected image. Dolphins did learn to mark objects underwater faster than divers. Bats did roost in mock structures carrying inert charges. These glimpses weren't mirages, they were partial truths. They told officials, "You're not crazy to try this." They also hid the gap between a demonstration and deployment. This was the moment everything changed for one service in particular. The Navy, living with mines, saboteurs, and narrow straits where a single explosive could shut down a fleet, looked at the ocean and saw an environment where sensors were primitive, visibility was poor, and threats were close. Mammals already lived there, evolved to read that world in ways no device then could match. If any animal program would meet the uncompromising test of operations, it would be in the water. Urgency, fear of surprise attacks, and the promise of a quiet edge made the gamble feel necessary. Enter the Navy's first consistent success, Dolphins. A living answer to a nightmare problem, fast, precise, and deniable, perfectly tuned to trigger curiosity and controversy. The Navy's Dolphins and Sea Lions. Start with the stakes. Mines don't announce themselves. They wait in murky water, anchored to nothing but a bad decision, and a ship pays the price. In narrow choke points, one diver with a limpet charge can stall a convoy or threaten a nuclear sub. That's the problem the U.S. Navy faced from the 1960s onward, low-visibility threats in high-value waters. Divers were slow, sonar was crude in cluttered harbors, and the margin for error was thin. If a living sensor could patrol continuously and find a mine before a ship did, lives would be saved. While that was happening in San Diego, engineers watched bottlenose dolphins do something machines couldn't: discriminate objects by sound with stunning precision. Echolocation, clicks that paint the underwater world, let dolphins see a mine casing hidden in silt, a shape tucked into pier pilings, a diver at night. Trainers learned to shape behaviors around that ability. The bet was simple: teach a dolphin to search a grid, mark what doesn't belong, and signal a handler. Not to blow it up, just to find it reliably and quickly. The Navy built routines. A boat would drop a dolphin at the edge of a search box. The animal swam a path, clicked, listened, clicked again. If it detected a target, it marked the spot with a buoy clipped from a harness or surfaced and touched a panel on the boat to indicate found. A separate disposal team handled explosives. The speed shocked people. In training tanks, dolphins outpaced divers by orders of magnitude. In open water, they still beat everything else the Navy had for short-range detection. Sea lions entered the picture for a different reason. They don't echolocate, but they're agile, have sharp eyes in low light, and can chase a human underwater without bubbles or motor noise. Handlers developed interdiction tasks, attach a clamp to a swimmer's leg or gear that tethered them to a surface buoy. Security teams could then reel in a suspect without lethal force. In ports that stored nuclear weapons or kept ballistic missile submarines, that mattered. Officially, these missions were non-lethal. The animal found or tagged. People handled the rest. The first operational heritage traces to Vietnam-era efforts. The Navy established a program near Point Loma, San Diego, and forward-deployed teams to evaluate port security and mine countermeasures in muddy, debris-filled environments. Reports from those years, later trickling out through declassifications and FOIA, describe animals identifying test mines faster than any human team and disrupting mock saboteurs during exercises. The work never fit the image of weaponized animals attacking targets. The core value was detection and marking. Here's a micro-story. A handler in a small rigid-hull boat held a shaker full of fish on his lap and tapped the edge of the console. The dolphin surfaced, bumped the panel with its rostrum, and rolled back under. Minutes later, a bright buoy bobbed up 30 yards away, tied by a thin line to something heavy on the bottom. The handler radioed the EOD team. The diver who swam down later said the mine would have fooled him. A tire and chain framed it perfectly against junk. The dolphin hadn't been fooled. Meanwhile, the bureaucracy adapted. The program built veterinary care, transport protocols, and deployment kits. Specialized pens followed ships. Aircraft carried animals in stretchers filled with water and foam. Trainers, many of whom formed deep bonds with their animals, learned to read stress, tune schedules, and argue for rest periods when operations demanded more than biology could give. Their journals told a different story than procurement memos. Individual temperaments, off days, a dolphin that loved a certain target shape and ignored another until retrained. Controversy shaped the narrative from outside. Activists accused the Navy of offensive use, teaching dolphins to deliver explosives or harm divers. The Navy denied it consistently, framing the mission as defensive, find, mark, and deter. Interviews and internal documents backed the detection-first story, though rumors lingered in part because the program was classified for years. Every leak created a vacuum filled by speculation. Trainers who spoke later described the hardest part as the public thinking their animals were weapons, not sentries. Then came real deployments. In the Persian Gulf, during mine clearance operations around the Iran-Iraq War's sprawl of hazards, and again in the early 2000s, Navy teams used dolphins to sweep approaches and anchorages. The animals marked suspect objects, divers verified and neutralized them. In those waters full of scrap and noise, the dolphins' discrimination mattered. Even with better sonar, the last 10 meters were tricky. A fast, trainable mammal could reduce false positives and speed the work. Sea lions saw work in harbor security at home. Their interdiction cuffs, spring-loaded rings with a line, were quietly tested alongside human patrols. The idea wasn't to make arrests underwater. It was to stop a swimmer's progress and flag their location without bullets or explosives in crowded ports. Whether these were used in anger remains murky. Officially, the program highlights demonstrations and exercises. Trainers, bound by non-disclosure agreements, hint at real-world events without details. The ambiguity fuels the ethical debate. If we can't see the record, how do we judge the practice? What nobody knew at the time outside small circles was how hard captivity ethics shaped daily choices. Dolphins and sea lions need stimulation, social groups, and medical care. Trainers pushed for enrichment, larger enclosures, and retirements. Some animals were transferred to marine parks after service. Others lived out their days at Navy facilities. Cases of illness or stress became flashpoints in press coverage. The Navy responded with tour, limited access for journalists, and research partnerships to show improved welfare standards. But skepticism remained. Internationally, the mirror was familiar. The Soviet Navy ran similar cetacean programs. Beluga whales, dolphins, and seals trained for underwater tasks in the Black Sea. After the USSR collapsed, reports surfaced of facilities changing hands, animals sold or moved, and occasional claims of revived units. The arms race logic extended underwater. If they're doing it, we can't stop. That reasoning kept budgets alive even as technology improved. Meanwhile, technology was catching up. Side-scan sonar got sharper. Synthetic aperture and interferometric systems mapped seabeds with high resolution. Autonomous underwater vehicles extended endurance and reduced human exposure. The Dolphin was still faster up close, still better at some last-meter judgments, but the trend line favored machines. Inside the program, that tension was obvious. Trainers taught new tasks, complex buoy placement, deep dives, while procurement officers funded unmanned systems that would someday replace them. The program's internal language shifted to emphasize non-lethal roles and scientific contributions. Papers on echolocation, cognition, and hydrodynamics came out of Navy-linked research, contributing to broader marine science. This had a public relations benefit and a real knowledge benefit. At the same time, the mission set narrowed: mines, objects, intruders. Anything that smelled like a fence stayed off the table publicly and by most accounts in practice. There were still quiet denials. A memo would surface through FOIA outlining a capability test that sounded a lot like offensive planning. The Navy would say it never left the lab. A former handler would say they refused certain tasks. Between those lines sat the truth of most classified programs, boundaries negotiated in rooms without cameras, with people who had to balance orders, ethics, and the animal in front of them. This was the moment everything changed again, not because a Dolphin failed, but because success hardened a belief across the services. Animals could deliver in narrow, well-defined tasks tied to their natural strengths. That belief, documented in performance reports and quiet commendations, became the justification for other proposals. While the Navy doubled down on mammals, an academic tried Pigeon, Project Pigeon/Orcan. To understand why the Navy's success emboldened others, go inland into a lab where a behaviorist believed you could shape a mind the way you shape clay. B.F. Skinner, already famous for his operant conditioning work, had a wartime idea that sounded absurd and in controlled tests looked brilliant: pigeons guiding a bomb. Start with the stakes. In 1943, precision bombing was more hope than reality. Cloud cover, flak, and shaky optics turned strategic into statistical. A single bomb reliably hitting a small, moving target like a ship was a fantasy. Electronics weren't ready. Radar guidance existed, but systems were bulky, easily jammed, or too crude for pinpoint strikes. Skinner offered a workaround: a simple glide bomb with a nose full of trained perception. Here's how it worked. In a plexiglass nose cone, a small screen displayed the target image via a lens. 3 pigeons sat in harnesses behind it. When they pecked the image, operant behavior shaped by thousands of training trials, the pecks moved aerodynamic veins. If the target drifted left, the pigeons pecked left. The control system corrected right to recenter the image. Skinner's lab had already shown pigeons could peck at specific shapes and keep pecking despite noise, flashes, even jolt. Now he tied that persistence to steering. The action happened in long, repetitive training runs. Skinner and his team built mock-ups with projected ships, buildings, and contrasting backgrounds. The pigeons learned through rewards. Grain delivered the moment a peck hit the right spot. Over time, the birds became astonishingly consistent. In demonstrations, they kept the target centered despite perturbations. A jolt sent the image off-center. The birds pecked furiously until it returned. Navy evaluators, summoned discreetly, watched through a window as the screen lurched and then stilled. The birds didn't panic. They worked the problem. Skinner, who loved data more than drama, brought charts. Error rates dropped with training hours. Peck latency decreased. In one famous demo, a single pigeon outperformed a human trying to joystick a drifting image on a comparable apparatus because the bird didn't anticipate or overcorrect. It simply followed the operant rule it had learned. In another, the 3-bird council outperformed any individual bird because the system averaged their pecks and damped out idiosyncrasy. This wasn't guesswork. It was engineering through behavior. But leadership balked. The ridicule factor was real. Bombs guided by birds sounded like a cartoon. Even as the National Defense Research Committee funded early phases under a code number, skeptical officers asked hard questions. What happens in heavy cloud? What if the target changes shape? How do we ensure the birds keep working under G-loads, smoke, or fire? Skinner answered with more training protocols, shock and noise conditioning, and better fixtures. He argued that pigeons weren't thinking. They were responding reliably, under conditions you could simulate. Competing technology nudged the decision. Radar guidance and proximity fuses were improving. The Navy had its own glide bomb projects using TV cameras and radio links, crude but getting better. In that arms race, a program that required live animals on the tip of a bomb, even if it worked, raised logistics and maintenance questions nobody wanted. You couldn't store pigeons in crates on a carrier for months and expect peak performance. You needed trainers, food, constant conditioning. The birds were not plug-and-play. Still, the performance was hard to ignore. When Project Pigeon was cancelled late in the war, Skinner wasn't crushed so much as convinced he'd been early. He filed reports, packed the apparatus, and moved on. Years later, during the early Cold War, the idea resurfaced as ORCAN, short for Organic Control. The new pitch softened the bird imagery and emphasized the control concept. Biological sensors doing visual pattern recognition better than then-current electronics. The problem hadn't changed. Guiding a bomb precisely without bulky, fragile computation. ORCAN revisited the tri-bird configuration and tightened the engineering. Stronger harnesses, better damping, refined training images with higher contrast, and screen masking to reduce distractions. Again, tests showed surprising accuracy. Again, evaluators left intrigued. But time was running out on biology as guidance. TV guidance got smarter. Analog circuits improved. By the late 1950s, digital computation was on the horizon, and with it, the promise of guidance that didn't need food, rest, or veterinary care. Impact first, then legacy. Officially, ORCAN closed without ever seeing combat. No pigeon-guided bomb flew against an enemy, yet the program wasn't a joke inside the labs. It was a serious attempt to solve a real problem with the tools available before electronics caught up. It generated data that fed behavior science and human factors engineering, how organisms track moving stimuli, how to stabilize attention under stress, how to design displays that drive reliable responses. There's a human moment tucked in Skinner's notes. He wrote that the birds were industrious and indifferent to the gadgetry, a scientist's way of saying they worked without drama. He also acknowledged the discomfort. The animals would have died with the weapon. He justified it as wartime calculus, thousands dying in bombings versus a handful of birds saving lives through precision. That moral arithmetic ran through many projects of the era, but in ORCAN, it sat right at the tip of the weapon, visible through clear plastic. What nobody outside a small circle knew then was how the near success warped future thinking. ORCAN became a template for a certain kind of proposal. Find an animal's natural strength, build a device around it, argue that biology beats the machine at least for now. The pitch migrated: dolphins for mines, bats for incendiaries, cats for surveillance, each leaning on that early demonstration that trained behavior could drive a weapon as surely as any circuit. And yet the outcome taught the opposite lesson too. When electronics finally surpassed the birds, they did so decisively and cheaply at scale. Guidance didn't need food. Engineers could replicate a sensor in hours. Trainers needed weeks to shape a pigeon. Reliability and logistics beat cleverness. The program's failure wasn't technical embarrassment. It was the slow, quiet recognition that technology had lapped it. Skinner's pigeons almost worked. That almost mattered. It kept doors open for other animal projects that promised precision without silicon. If pigeons could steer a bomb on a test bench, someone asked, could bats deliver a fire to 1,000 roofs at once? The bat bomb plan. Stakes were brutal and specific: burn down cities without flying 1,000 planes. In 1942, Japanese urban centers were dense with wooden homes and paper walls. Incendiaries worked. The question was delivery. A dentist from Pennsylvania, Little S. Adams, thought he had the answer after driving past a bat cave in New Mexico. Bats nested by the millions, slipped into tiny crevices at dawn, and clung inside roofs during daylight. His idea: turn that instinct into a weapon. Adams wrote straight to the White House. He knew Eleanor Roosevelt socially, and his letter landed on a desk that mattered. The pitch read like a parable of wartime improvisation. Strap miniature time-delay incendiaries to Mexican free-tailed bats, release them at pre-dawn over a city, let the animals roost inside attic spaces, and allow thousands of simultaneous microfires to begin when the sun rose. Unlike conventional bombing, which hit blocks and streets, this would seed fire from within. If even a fraction roosted, the city would become a constellation of ignition points beyond firefighting capacity. To understand why anyone took this seriously, you have to look at bat biology. Mexican free-tailed bats migrate in dense clouds, return to roosts reliably, and squeeze into cracks barely wider than a finger. They leave at dusk, feed, return at dawn, and seek cavities with shelter, exactly the kind of spaces that proliferated in wooden construction. If an incendiary could be small enough and delayed just right, the bat wouldn't trigger the device mid-flight. It would settle, nap, and then fire. The action moved fast. The National Defense Research Committee greenlit preliminary work. A team pulled bats from Carlsbad caverns and surrounding caves, learned to chill them into torpor for storage, and designed carriers that could release thousands gradually as they warmed. The ordnance piece fell to an inventor named Louis Fieser-Circle, already working on incendiaries. The device needed to weigh about as much as a few coins, burn hot, and ignite flammable material for minutes. Engineers tinkered with nitrocellulose and napalm gels inside tiny casings with an attached clip. Testing unfolded like a strange field trip. At Carlsbad Army Airfield, they built mock towns with Japanese-style construction, paper walls, wood frames, tile roofs with gaps bats loved. Early releases were promising. Chilled bats, warmed on schedule, flew to shelter and clung under eaves and rafters. When the charges activated, multiple test structures lit quickly. Observers wrote that the spread of fire exceeded expectations compared to a single large incendiary. The dispersion was the point. Then the infamous accident. During one series of tests in 1943 at the auxiliary air base near Carlsbad, some armed bats escaped the test grid and roosted under a fuel tank and in other base structures. The time fuses did their job. Fires broke out where nobody intended. A hangar and parts of the fuel facility burned. The note in the report was dry. The method was effective. The subtext was chaos. If the weapon could torch a U.S. base accidentally under supervision, commanders imagined what wind and unpredictability would do over a city. Both as promise and as risk, champions kept pushing. Adams believed the accident proved the concept's power, not its failure. He brought in consultants, reminded officials that Japanese firefighting capacity was limited, and argued the humanitarian calculus. If this worked, it might force surrender without radiation or massive blast casualties. The Navy took over from the Army, rebranding the project under its code, and moved testing to the Marine Corps Air Station El Centro and the Naval Air Station at China Lake, places with space to stage larger drops. The delivery mechanism evolved into a bat bomb, a cluster canister shaped like a bomb casing, packed with radial trays holding bats in individual slots. Released from altitude, the casing would deploy small parachutes and open at a preset height. Trays sprang apart, exposing the bats to warming air. Each animal wore a tiny device glued to its chest with surgical cement, fitted with a spring clip to hold the charge and a 15 to 30-minute fuse. The engineering problem was clockwork reliability in miniature. The biological problem was everything else: temperature, shock, wind, and a living creature's unpredictability. Delays mounted. Each solution sprouted new complications. Glue caused skin irritation, a bat groomed the pack loose, fuses drifted with temperature changes. Chilling worked, but the rewarming curve varied by individual, weather changed roosting patterns. Scale required staggering numbers, hundreds of thousands of bats to blanket a large city, and logistics strained credibility. Collecting, chilling, transporting, arming, and deploying living creatures at that volume looked less like a bomb and more like a flying wrench with explosives. Meanwhile, another project sprinted ahead in the desert under maximum secrecy. The Manhattan Project ate resources, attention, and urgency. Even the Navy's bat program managers felt the pull. In inter-service meetings, the question shifted from could it work to could it work in time? By late 1944, the projected operational date had slipped again. Adams claimed the weapon could be ready by mid-1945. Others weren't convinced. Japan's defenses and the air war's tempo were changing weekly. Precision wasn't the only route. Overwhelming force was already burning cities. The internal assessments after El Centro and China Lake were sober. As a fire-starting concept, the bat dispersal worked in test towns. The accident at Carlsbad accidentally served as a perverse proof of concept, but the logistical overhead and timing specificity were brutal. To hit a city at pre-dawn, in the right season for bat behavior, with weather favorable for roosting, and with fuses tuned to local temperature, those variables stacked up. Planners compared that complexity to dropping conventional incendiary clusters, which were already devastating wooden neighborhoods. Cost wasn't the primary canceling factor, but it mattered. The BAT program had consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars, serious but not massive compared to major weapons. The real spend was time and attention in a war racing toward different answers. By early 1945, the Navy pulled the plug. The official reason combined logistics, competing priorities, and the emergence of more reliable tools. The BAT bomb never flew over Japan. Here's the impact with clarity. The program didn't change the war, but it marked a boundary line. Biological delivery of fire could be efficient in theory and impressive in controlled tests, yet it buckled under operational demand. The spectacle of a U.S. base catching fire during testing became a cautionary tale inside R&D circles. Demonstrations can mislead when the environment itself is the co-conspirator. There's a human coda. Adams, the dentist who set it all in motion, never stopped believing. In later interviews, he insisted the BAT bomb would have ended the war without Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That claim is unprovable and rests on assumptions about Japanese response and firefighting. Historians treat it as advocacy from a man who saw his idea sidelined by a larger shadow. What remains in the declassified files is the blend of ingenuity and hubris. Precise fuses taped to a wild animal's chest, a weapon designed to vanish into rafters and wake as flame. From mass swarms to a single feline enter Acoustic Kitty. The idea hits the brain, I have to hear this button. A house pet wired to eavesdrop, walking straight into the heart of spycraft. Project Acoustic Kitty. Start with the stakes. In the thick of the Cold War, intelligence lived in public spaces, park benches near embassies, cafe tables outside safe houses, cars idling at curbs where handlers passed microfilm. Human agents stood out, microphones were bulky, and covert placement risked discovery. The CIA faced a stubborn question. How do you hear a conversation at arm's length without a person sitting there? The answer they funded felt like a dare to biology. Turn a cat into a mobile listening device. Here's the premise. Cats could loiter, drift close to people without alarming them, and slip through fences and hedges where microphones couldn't go. Engineers proposed embedding a microphone into the cat's body, routing a wire along the spine, and using the tail as a flexible antenna to transmit audio to a nearby receiver. Veterinary specialists would handle surgery. Trainers would shape behavior, approach a target on cue, tolerate harnesses and equipment, and ignore distraction. On paper, it solved a classic surveillance problem with plausible deniability. If it failed, it was just a stray. The work unfolded in an office park far from headlines. The agency contracted audio wizards who'd built bugs for embassies and cars. They needed components that were tiny, stable, and resistant to body movement. Early prototypes tucked a microphone into the ear canal, a transmitter in the chest cavity, and a battery pack under the skin, with the tail acting as a radiating element. Each element raised new issues. The mic picked up heartbeats and digestive noises. The transmitter needed power, but weight altered the cat's gait. The tail antenna had to radiate without frying tissue. Every fix rippled. Trainers stepped in with an entirely different set of problems. Cats aren't pigeons. They don't peck on cue. They don't heel like dogs. They learn but selectively, and their motivation is unstable under stress. The team built routines anchored in food rewards and habituation, short, straight approaches to a designated voice, gradual tolerance of equipment, and reinforcement when the cat stayed near a target. Progress was real but fragile. A gust of wind, a horn, a new smell. Any change could send the animal off plan. Trainers documented small wins and frustrating regressions. Meanwhile, the surgeons refined their craft. Implantation had to be safe, infection-free, and minimally obtrusive. Anesthesia protocols shifted. Suture placement adjusted to prevent the cat from worrying at a seam. The audio path, ear canal to transmitter, went through iterations to dampen internal noise. Engineers designed filters to strip low-frequency rumbles. The team added an external harness for some tests to offload power and reduce heat inside the body. That solved one issue and introduced another: bulk and visibility. The first field test became lore. The story, recounted years later by former officers and in declassified fragments, went like this. The cat, recently outfitted, was released near a public bench where two targets sat talking. The plan: the animal would cross a small street, hop up, and linger. Handlers across the way listened on a receiver, ready to adjust. The cat trotted a few yards, paused, and veered into traffic. A taxi ended the mission. Another account softens the blow. It wandered off toward food and never reached the bench. In both versions, the problem wasn't hardware, it was control in the wild. Inside the program, that day didn't end the work. Teams adjusted protocols, rehearsed with decoys, and tried settings with fewer variables. They got usable audio in controlled trials. A cat placed near a conversation captured voices that gear hidden in a lamppost could miss. But operational constraints piled up. Agents needed predictable windows. Surveillance teams couldn't risk an animal bolting or drawing attention. Street noise overwhelmed the mic unless the cat was very close. The tail antenna compromise worked only at short ranges and quirky angles. The system demanded perfection in a place that refused to give it. Costs rose, years slipped by. The bill, by later accounts in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, wasn't huge by weapons standards, but it was significant for a single capabilities niche. Managers defended the spend as proof of concept. Critics inside the building asked whether a smarter microphone, better placement, or a human with a newspaper could do the job with fewer variables. The answer, increasingly, was yes. Miniaturization in electronics accelerated. Passive resonant bugs improved. Directional microphones got stronger and smaller. Every tech gain narrowed the cat's use case. Then came the internal assessment, the kind that lives quietly in an archive until it leaks. It concluded the idea was impractical, not physically impossible. The surgeries worked and audio could be captured, but operationally unsound. You couldn't count on a cat to go where you planned or stay where you needed in noisy, dynamic streets. You couldn't shield transmissions perfectly, and the animal's welfare introduced risks that didn't belong in a mission where failure could spark diplomatic incident. The report's language was dry. The message was not. There's a human moment from a trainer's recollection. He described spending evenings just sitting with a cat in a quiet room, letting it get used to a harness and the rustle of fabric. He said the animal would settle, purr even, and then startle at a door click and refuse to move for 20 minutes. He realized then that he was trying to smooth out a creature's instincts for a task that demanded none. He didn't quit, but he stopped believing the field would ever be kind enough. Public knowledge came much later. In the 1990s and 2000s, declassifications and memoirs pulled the project into the spotlight. Headlines made it sound like a parody, spy cats with antennas in their tails. Jokes wrote themselves. Lost in the laughter was the quiet seriousness of the original problem and the real sophistication of the surgery and audio engineering. It wasn't a cartoon. It was a wrong turn taken by people trying to solve a hard problem in an era that rewarded audacity and smothered scrutiny. Ethically, Acoustic Kitty sat on a fault line. The animals were tools in a risky space. The agency's own vets were involved, and care standards were better than in many labs at the time, but the end state was still an animal with implants sent into environments it couldn't understand. Because the program was classified, there wasn't a public debate about whether that was acceptable. The decision lived in a compartment with few voices to contest it beyond practical critiques. Secrecy didn't just hide the project, it insulated it from moral friction, meaning lands here. Acoustic Kitty shows the boundary between ingenuity and absurdity is only clear in hindsight. In the moment, it looked like a clever answer to a real need, built by smart engineers and careful trainers. It also shows how secrecy can shield failure long enough to consume time better spent elsewhere. The project produced techniques that flowed into legitimate audio tradecraft and animal surgery knowledge, but as an operational capability, it never escaped the lab. Meanwhile, other animals were drafted into stranger roles, oddities, and side experiments. While acoustic cats and bat bombs grabbed headlines decades later, the sidelines held a weirder catalog of trials that flickered, failed, or left dubious lessons. They reveal the same pattern. Take a real battlefield problem, graft it onto an animal's natural skill, and hope training overrides chaos. Start with dogs that were supposed to hunt tanks. The US studied it, the Soviets fielded it. Trainers strapped explosives to dogs and taught them to run under vehicles where a lever would detonate. In theory, a low silhouette could slip past fire and disable armor. In practice, the dogs learned on friendly diesel-smelling tanks, then balked at enemy gasoline engines and different noise profiles. On the Eastern Front, some ran back to handlers with predictable tragedy. Reliability cratered because scent and stress trumped drills. The American evaluation, reading Soviet reports, concluded that canine anti-tank roles were unpredictable and ethically fraught, and quietly shelved the idea. Ravens and crows tempted planners with intelligence and flight in cluttered airspace. Proposals surfaced to use corvids as couriers or retrieval specialists. Teach a raven to fly to a window, grab a small pouch, and return to a portable loft. Trainers noted corvid problem-solving was real. Birds could learn complex sequences. Tests showed promise in short, familiar routes with consistent landmarks. Then wind shifted, reflections changed, and urban noise scrambled cues. Without a stable homing instinct like pigeons, reliability dipped below operational thresholds. The concept never matured past demonstrations and a few quixotic memos. Meanwhile, air forces fought birds as hazards while some units considered using them. Airfields built anti-bird defenses, pyrotechnics, falconry, radar-linked scare cannons, because a flock through an engine could ground squadrons. In parallel, a handful of studies asked if trained raptors could clear skies on command before sorties. The answer was sometimes. Falcons intimidated gulls and starlings in narrow windows, but migrations and weather overwhelmed control. The winning solution wasn't weaponizing wildlife. It was habitat management, radar detection, and timing. There were rodents in the file cabinets, too. Concepts to use rats for tunnel reconnaissance or to carry sensors into tight spaces appeared on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Rats excel at squeezing through gaps and navigating mazes. Trainers built harnesses and taught basic left-right responses. In labs, they mapped simple tunnels. In the field, moisture, debris, and scent confounded them. Signals dropped in soil. Battery life ran out. The insight that small animals can scout would later morph into disposable robots that didn't need food or handling. Then you find the magnetoreception folders, questions about whether animals with sensitivity to magnetic fields could cue mines or submarines. Pigeons, turtles, even fish were studied for orientation behaviors that might hint at unseen metal or anomalies. Controlled experiments showed subtle responses to fields, but the signal-to-noise ratio in seawater or cluttered harbors was awful. The practical takeaway wasn't an animal detector. It was a better appreciation for noise floors that later guided sensor development. Across the ocean, the Soviet Mirror offered its own catalog. In addition to anti-tank dogs, there were cetacean programs in the Black Sea, dolphins for harbor security, belugas rumored for Arctic tasks, seals explored for object tagging. Reports after 1991 described facilities near Sevastopol shifting control, animals sold or transferred, and sporadic attempts to restart training. The logic matched the American one. Detection and marking succeeded more often than offensive myths persisted, dolphins with knives or explosives. But documentation pointed to interdiction and alerting roles, plus research in sonar-like biological signals. Spy-bird ideas popped up repeatedly. A few Western proposals explored attaching lightweight cameras or microphones to train birds to loiter near windowsills. Early gear was heavy, lenses fogged, and flight paths drifted. When micro-cameras finally got small, drones outpaced the birds. The same pattern recurred. By the time training produced tolerable performance, electronics made the animal redundant. Even the insect file had entries. Researchers considered moths and bees as scent couriers or as triggers for micro-switches. Honeybees can detect odors at parts per billion and signal with distinct movements. Lab rigs taught bees to associate scents with feeders, then measured wingbeat changes as detection events. Fascinating science, minimal field practicality. Wind and background odors drowned signals outside controlled spaces. The lasting value was in biosensors that mimicked the insects, olfactory pathways, not in deploying hives to battlefields. A micro-story from a Cold War lab captures the tone. A tech taped a tiny transmitter to a starling's back and released it in a courtyard bounded by glass buildings. The bird circled, fixated on its reflection, and spent 15 minutes attacking a window. The recorded audio was crystal clear, but it wasn't espionage. It was a bird furious at an imagined rival. The handler logged equipment performed as designed. Subject did not. What ties these oddities together isn't animals, it's institutions under pressure. When a commander needs an answer now, and a white paper promises edge cases where biology shines, experiments get greenlit. But the winds cluster around detection and simple tagging, behaviors aligned with instincts, while complex offense fails in the wild. Weather, distraction, fear, and the animal's own agency intrude. Electronics and autonomy nibble away at the mission until, quietly, the animal leaves the loop. Ethics, law, and public backlash start with stakes you can feel. These weren't gadgets failing quietly in a lab. They were living creatures trained, implanted, and deployed under orders, often without anyone outside a narrow circle knowing they existed. Sentience meant suffering counted. State power meant the choices were made in our name, even when we weren't allowed to see them. That tension between mission and morality, secrecy and consent, shadowed every animal program. To understand the legal terrain, go back to the patchwork of protections. The Animal Welfare Act set standards for housing, veterinary care, and research protocols, but national security programs sat behind classification walls and carved out exceptions. Institutional animal care and use committees existed, yet their reach into black programs was limited by need-to-know rule. On paper, there were veterinarians and protocols. In practice, oversight depended on the same chain of command that wanted results. When ethics and operations collided, classification tilted the scale. Meanwhile, law intersected with optics. Marine mammals enjoyed special attention under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but the Navy could request waivers for national defense. Those waivers weren't rubber stamps, they required findings and conditions. Still, the very existence of a waiver process told handlers two things. The program was recognized by law, and it could continue when justified. That blend, legal but exceptional, became the official stance. We do this rarely, carefully, and only when necessary. Public exposure arrived in pulses. Declassified memos on bat tests, oral histories about Pigeon steering images, FOIA releases on marine mammal deployments, and a stray line about a cat with an antenna tail. Each revelation landed like a punchline until the details turned sobering. Headlines mocked Acoustic Kitty, activists fixated on dolphins trained to kill. The Navy countered with briefings, facility visits, and the phrase that recurred in every statement, non-lethal. Find, mark, deter. The word choice mattered. It narrowed the moral frame, distancing humans from harm while acknowledging an animal's role in risk. Here's where the messaging found its limits. Non-lethal didn't erase captivity or stress. Trainers reported ulcers, infections, and behavioral changes they worked to prevent. They lobbied for larger pens, more enrichment, and retirements to sanctuaries or marine parks. Some got what they asked for. Others left quietly when mission tempo outpaced care capacity. Those resignations never made the press releases, but they show up later in interviews. Handlers who loved their animals and hated certain tasks, who negotiated with superiors one schedule at a time. The press saw enough to spark outrage cycles. When a facility lost an animal during transport or a lawsuit surfaced alleging poor care, coverage surged. The Navy answered with data, survival rates, veterinary staffing, research outputs on echolocation and physiology. That strategy worked with some audiences. Numbers and peer-reviewed papers signal seriousness, but not with others. For many viewers, the image of a dolphin wearing gear outweighed charts. That split defined the public debate. Spreadsheets versus sentiment, mission brief versus a mammal's eye. Internationally, the landscape complicated the ethics. Reports of Soviet and later Russian cetacean units fed an arms race narrative. If adversaries use animals, abandoning them unilaterally looks naive. Treaties didn't resolve it. There was no specific global ban on military use of animals. Humanitarian law addressed unnecessary suffering broadly, not species by species. Marine mammal protections were stronger in some national waters, weaker in others. Ambiguity let each state argue necessity on its own terms. Activists responded with campaigns aimed at reputational cost. Protests at aquariums partnered with navies, petitions targeting budgets, boycotts of ports that hosted deployments. Inside programs, ethics wasn't abstract. It played out in tiny negotiations. A handler asked for a shorter search window because water temperature had dropped 3 degrees. A vet flagged a stress marker and paused training, knowing a commander wanted a readiness demo for VIPs. A program manager weighed a FOIA request and prepped a carefully redacted release, trying to show care practices without inviting new lines of attack. The daily grind sat far from the big slogans, but it's where animals either suffered more or less. What nobody knew at the time outside classified rooms was how often ethics and effectiveness aligned. The simplest truth, a healthy, unstressed animal performed better. Better husbandry wasn't charity, it was operational necessity. That gave advocates leverage. They could sell improvements as readiness upgrades. Larger pens reduced stereotypic behavior and boosted task compliance. Rotations prevented burnout and lowered error rates. Over time, that alignment raised baselines across facilities. even without a public reckoning. Then came technology as an ethical release valve. As AUVs improved and portable sensors got cheaper, commanders found it easier to argue for phasing out some animal tasks. It wasn't a moral concession, it was a procurement decision framed by capability. But the effect was the same: fewer deployments, more retirements, less heat. Official statements started to mention transition to unmanned systems, the way earlier memos justified waivers. The story softened not because the debate ended, but because the mission moved. Still, secrecy kept a shadow. When programs say, "Trust us," critics ask for independent oversight. Some proposals suggested outside ethicists with clearances embedded in review boards, sunset clauses for waivers, and public annual reports with non-sensitive metrics: number of animals, deployments, retirements, clinical incidents. A few of those ideas gained traction in limited forms, advisory visits, published welfare studies, but not the full transparency activists wanted. The gap sustained suspicion, even as harm decreased. There's a micro-story from a FOIA file. A handwritten note in the margin of a 1970s memo reads, "Remind Admiral, phrase is non-lethal, not harmless." That single correction captures the ethical line. Non-lethal admits force and restraint exist. Harmless would have been a lie. Language didn't save animals from stress or prevent bad days, but it forced officials to choose words that own the risk. For viewers trying to judge from outside the vault, those words are one of the few anchors available. In the aftermath of each revelation, audiences asked the same question: was any of this worth it? Officials pointed to mines found, intruders deterred, knowledge gained. Activists pointed to lives in pens and bodies modified for missions. Both were true in their lanes. The unresolved part sat in the middle: how much hidden coercion a democracy tolerates when it involves creatures that can't consent, and how much secrecy it will trade for claims of safety. Beyond morals, did any of this actually work? What worked? What failed, and why? Start with the wins, because they shaped everything that followed. Animals succeeded when tasks matched instincts, environments fit their sensory strengths, and mission demands stayed simple. Dolphins detecting and marking objects underwater worked because echolocation is their superpower, short search windows fit their stamina, and find, mark, report is a tight behavior loop. Sea lions tagging swimmers succeeded when visibility was low, but distances were short and handlers were close. Even the near wins, pigeons tracking images, thrived under controlled stimulus response conditions. In these lanes, reliability came from alignment. Biology doing what biology already does, nudged by training, supported by repeatable routines. Scale that up and patterns appear. The success lane had clear traits: bounded spaces, short timelines, binary outcomes, and separable phases. Detection was one phase, neutralization another. Animals didn't have to solve the whole problem. They solved a piece: locate, indicate, attach. Trainers could reinforce the sequence until it stuck, then keep variables limited. Logistics were demanding but not absurd. Pens, transport, veterinary care, a small team of specialists. Commanders could accept those costs because the payoff, faster clearance, fewer false positives, arrived quickly and measurably. Failure clustered where missions demanded complex navigation, stealth approach through chaotic terrain, or precision timing under uncontrollable conditions. Bat bombs fell apart because the delivery window had to thread weather, temperature, city architecture, and a living swarm's unpredictable choices. Acoustic Kitty crumbled in the field because an urban soundscape overwhelmed a tiny mic, and a cat's attention wandered at the worst moment. Anti-tank dogs failed when battlefield sense, engine types, and fear scrambled training cues. If the assignment required an animal to behave like a deterministic machine inside a hurricane of variables, the variables won. Add the stealth factor. Animals didn't fail because they're loud, they failed because stealth takes consistency. In port security, a dolphin could pass as wildlife until it surfaced near a boat with a harness glinting in sunlight. In espionage, a cat loitering near officials looked normal until it didn't. The closer a mission got to adversary scrutiny, the more one odd motion or a curious glance could unravel the plan. Machines eventually solved that by being smaller, cheaper, and less alive. A lost drone doesn't mourn. A lost animal draws scrutiny. Timing killed as many projects as performance. Precision in the wild means controlling when effects happen. The BAT program needed ignition minutes after roosting, in the right part of the day, across thousands of microlocations. That's choreography on a city scale, with wind, eaves, and sunrise all acting as uncooperative partners. Even Pigeon's guiding bombs faced timing stress. A bird's focus can drift, fatigue matters, and a weapon's time to target can't pause for a snack. Every second removed from a tight feedback loop created room for failure. Now put technology on the timeline. During the window when animals outperformed early electronics, their edge was real. Pigeons recognized shapes better than crude analog circuits. Dolphins resolved clutter better than 1960s sonar. But tech marched. TV-guided weapons matured, then laser seekers and GPS wiped out the pigeon niche. Side-scan sonar sharpened, then synthetic aperture and AUVs pushed detection beyond mammal range and endurance. Microphones shrank, processors filtered noise, and beamforming let humans capture conversations from distances no cat could approach safely. The replacement curve wasn't moral, it was math. Replication, maintenance, and unit cost crushed bespoke biological solutions. Cost-benefit lived in the margins. Training a dolphin team demanded months of conditioning, specialized transport, on-site pens, and a cadre of handlers. When the mission was clearing a minefield in weeks, that spend paid off. When the mission was a one-off surveillance gambit on a city street, the same investment looked reckless compared to a throwaway sensor. Animals also impose risk externalities. Public relations shocks, legal exposure, and diplomatic fallout if operations are exposed. Those aren't line items on a budget spreadsheet, but they show up later as program drag, more oversight, more briefings, more justifications. Reliability is where many programs broke. In demonstrations, trainers control variables, animals perform. In operations, variables multiply. A dolphin that marks 9 of 10 objects in a bay with known currents might drop to 6 of 10 at night in silt soup. A pigeon that tracks a high-contrast silhouette in a lab may hesitate when glare blooms on real water. Reliability thresholds in war are unforgiving. Miss one mine in a shipping channel and all the previous hits don't matter. That pressure favors systems that are calibratable, auditable, and reproducible at scale, traits machines own. Still, there's a psychological layer worth naming: novelty bias under stress. During wartime or crisis, leaders lean toward anything that promises a shortcut past entrenched problems. Animals do X naturally becomes a compelling sentence, especially when paired with a tidy demo. Optimism flattens the distance between a tank and a harbor. The pigeon's success becomes the cat's justification. The dolphin's victories grease the slope for the bat. Later, when tech renders the novelty unnecessary, the same bias can keep animals in service past their prime. Because sunk costs and institutional pride resist quiet sunsets. There's also the invisibility of partial value. Even failed programs produced knowledge. Acoustic Kitty pushed miniaturized audio engineering and surgical techniques. Pigeon research fed display design and attention studies. Bat trials clarified the logistical pain points of biological dispersal, insights that later guided how to model wildfire ignition or urban vulnerability. These side benefits were real, but they're not the mission officials sold. A commander doesn't brief. We'll learn a lot when the slide says operational capability by Q3. So what worked cleanly? Detection, marking, and close-range patrol, simple behaviors matched to natural senses, run in environments where handlers could intervene fast and where the animal's presence wasn't itself a liability. What failed? Long-range navigation in complex, hostile settings, precision timing tied to uncontrollable variables, stealth missions where any deviation exposed the whole plan, and anything that required an animal to be both sensor and delivery system under fire. That leaves the present tense. As sensors, autonomy, and AI vision mature, machines claim more of the success lane. AUVs sweep harbors, computer vision flags anomalies, drones loiter quietly. The remaining animal tasks sit where machines still struggle: last-meter judgments in clutter, dynamic interaction with humans underwater, and edge cases in messy environments. Even there, reliability math keeps pushing. The deeper story isn't about animals becoming obsolete. It's about institutions learning, slowly, to match tools to tasks without letting fear and imagination outrun the field. The human stories behind the programs start with the people who showed up with ideas and a need to be taken seriously. Little Adams wasn't a general. He was a dentist who believed bats could end a war. He drove west after Pearl Harbor with sketches and a conviction that nature hid a weapon planners had overlooked. When a White House aide called back, he didn't hear validation so much as permission to keep believing. In notes, he underlined phrases like humane alternative, as if he knew he'd have to defend the idea later to himself, not just to officials. Across a different corridor, B.F. Skinner set up his Pigeon harnesses with the calm of someone who trusted data over reputation. He wasn't chasing glory, he was chasing a result. In letters to colleagues, he's almost defensive about the birds, not the war. He knew the ridicule factor, and he leaned into clarity, using surprise to keep attention long enough for the data to land. "They work," he wrote, then spent paragraphs on peck latencies and error curve. He'd leave a demonstration, hear snickers in the hall, and go right back to the lab to tighten a variable. When the project closed, he filed the paperwork and folded the disappointment into a theory about institutions favoring respectable failures over strange successes. The Navy's champions sounded different. They lived in a world where a missed mine killed friends. An officer flew home from a Gulf deployment with a folder full of performance charts and a photograph of a dolphin surfacing beside a destroyer's gray hull. At a budget meeting, he laid the photo on the table before the graphs. "This is what found the mine," he said, then walked the room through detection times and false alarm rates. He wasn't asking for a miracle. He was asking for 12 more pens, 2 more trainers, and a plane with room for stretchers filled with seawater. Trainers filled the space between belief and biology. One handler carried a battered notebook with names and quirks, a sea lion that hated the color yellow on buoys, a dolphin that lost focus when helicopters hovered, a cat that tolerated a harness only after an hour of quiet in a warm room. Her days were part animal care, part diplomacy. She argued with an operations officer for a day off after a cold snap, then slept on a folding chair beside a pen because the pump sounded wrong. In the margins, she drew small arrows to mark progress, took clamp without mouthing, held station in chop. There were careers staked on the line between odd and operational. A program manager who'd shepherded a classified animal project from concept to field test knew that a cancellation memo could end his advancement. He rehearsed briefings like a trial lawyer, preempting jokes with results. When rumors swirled about offensive training, he tightened scripts for everyone on base. Stick to detection and interdiction. Cite the waiver authority, direct ethics questions to public affairs. He wasn't hiding a weaponized dolphin. He was protecting a budget from a punchline. Skeptics had their own long memory. An electronics engineer who'd watched a pigeon beat an early TV tracker carried that embarrassment into every future meeting. Decades later, when a colleague floated reviving an organic sensor, he said, "Buy me 2 more processors and a better lens." He'd learned that a machine's worst day could be debugged. An animal's worst day was just a bad day. He wasn't cynical. He was tired of hope being the plan. Micro-stories anchored the big arguments. A tech at China Lake watched a stray bat crawl behind a plywood wall and minutes later saw smoke thread through a seam. He didn't cheer. He sprinted for a fire extinguisher and thought, for the first time, about the janitor who'd have to explain a scorched hanger to a supervisor. Years later, at a reunion, he laughed about the absurdity and then went quiet at the memory of someone's career singed by a test that worked too well. A CIA audio specialist, hunched over a scope the size of a suitcase, listened to a cat-mounted microphone, pick up the scrape of a chair leg and the murmur of voices, then watched the signal vanish into city noise. He admired the surgical craft and hated the variance. Over coffee, he told a case officer, "Give me a wall and a plug," meaning let him wire a room instead of wiring a living thing. He wasn't a crusader. He was a professional who wanted odds he could defend. The inside jokes were defenses against the strangeness. Trainers called a favorite dolphin the Chief because it always beat a new device in a race to a target. A behaviorist taped a sign above a console, "No miracles after 140," to remind visitors that animals have afternoons, not just schedules. A project officer kept a coffee mug that read "Non-lethal since '68," a jab at the phrasing that framed every press release. Not everyone stayed. A young veterinarian left after 2 years, citing mission tempo versus welfare in a resignation letter that never saw daylight. Later, she told a reporter she'd learned more about dolphin dentistry than she'd imagined and more about bureaucratic language than she wanted. Her replacement negotiated a bigger quarantine tank as a condition of joining, won, and then wrote protocols that became standard across facility. Progress came one argument at a time, anchored in the quiet fact that a calmer animal made a better teammate. Then there are the notes nobody meant to be read. A penciled line in a 195's lab ledger. Bird 7 preferred ship silhouettes over coastal targets, retrain with randomized sequences. A late-night email from a harbor security chief. "If they cut us tomorrow, the mines won't care." A trainer's line on a base bulletin board after a hard week. "Be kind, the water remembers." Where does that leave the future? With people not just programs, believers who chase possibilities, caretakers who fight for small mercies, skeptics who keep everyone honest, and officers whose choices weigh lives in ships, labs, and pens. The next chapter depends on which of them gets the floor when the brief begins. The future, tech, ethics, and the quiet sunset. Everything shifts when machines finally match the ocean's patience and the street's indifference. Underwater drones now sweep harbors with synthetic aperture sonar, stitching crisp maps where dolphins once listened. They don't tire, don't need herring, and can loiter for days in currents that sap a mammal in hours. AI vision spots patterns in seabed clutter that once demanded a trainer's intuition, pipes versus mines, tires versus casings, flagging anomalies for human teams to verify. The last 10 meters, the hardest distance in this entire story, are getting easier for devices that never blink. On the surface, smaller sensors end the need for improvisations like cat microphones. Directional mics, laser vibrometry, and passive RF tools collect sound from standoff distances that would have seemed like magic to the Acoustic Kitty team. In urban settings, microdrones perch unseen and relay audio without a heartbeat rumble to filter. If a unit is lost, procurement logs a serial number. Nobody writes a memo about care standard. The moral weight doesn't disappear. It moves. But the argument for putting implants in animals shrinks with every battery and algorithm that improves. Program wind-downs are already happening in quiet increments. Retirements come with press photos and carefully worded lines about transitioning to unmanned solutions. Legacy marine mammal units still operate in focused roles. Last-meter object confirmation in extreme clutter, swimmer interdiction in special venues, limited deployments tied to events where false alarms would cascade into chaos. The Navy's internal planning documents lean on phrases like bridge capability, a recognition that drones need one more cycle of endurance and signal processing before the mammals can stand down entirely. The sunset isn't a single switch, it's a line creeping along a calendar. Policy debates are catching up to that reality. Inside committees, staffers push for sunset clauses on waivers, forcing periodic justification for any animal program that remains. Transparency proposals suggest public-facing summaries, number of animals deployed, days at sea, retirements, veterinary incidents. Independent oversight ideas, ethicists with clearances embedded in review boards, get a hearing when scandals run hot and fade when budgets tight. The most durable change comes from procurement language that bakes ethics into performance. Prefer systems that replace animal roles. If animals are used, prove no viable technical alternative exists. Internationally, the picture is uneven. Some states lean hard into drones and declare animal units legacy only, a phrase that acts like a promise without being one. Others keep marine mammal programs active, citing specific harbors, ice-choked waters, or adversaries with unknown mines. That asymmetry tempts a familiar logic. If they keep theirs, we keep ours. Treaties remain vague. Marine mammal protections still allow defense exemptions. No global rule bans animals in military roles outright. Activists pivot to reputational pressure, raiding ports, pressuring alliances, and tying aquarium partnerships to disclosure. Culturally, these programs have already shifted from marvels to punchlines to cautionary tales. A new generation meets bat bombs as a meme and then learns about a hangar fire that actually happened. Spy cats sounds like a joke until a declassified line describes a real surgery. That arc matters. It shapes what ideas get a hearing when the next crisis lands. Engineers now enter a room knowing that, but we used dolphins will draw a raised eyebrow and a slide about synthetic aperture advancements. The past is ammunition for prudence. Still, there's an open question that makes planners uneasy. What if technology fails in the first week of a war? GPS jammed, comms dirty, batteries scarce, drones lost to weather or countermeasures, do commanders reach for living backups? A few contingency plans still include animals as option C in narrow cases, mostly in ports where unique geography and muck make sensors stumble. Trainers argue those skills shouldn't atrophy until machines prove they can handle every edge case. Skeptics counter that edge cases become excuses, keeping a door ajar that should be closed. In labs, the energy has moved to bioinspired rather than biodeployed. Dolphin echolocation informs sonar pulse design. Sea lion agility guides manipulator arms on submersibles. Pigeon vision research feeds neural nets that track targets without fatigue. The result is a moral and practical synthesis. Learn from senses that evolved over millions of years, then build tools that don't need food, sleep, or consent. In a way, that's the real legacy of these programs. Translating biology into engineering without dragging the animal along. The quiet sunset, then, is not a victory parade. It's a slow shift in invoices and training calendars, a smaller line item for fish and a bigger one for lithium cells. It's a revised waiver template that expires by default, a facility converted from pens to test tanks for robots, a plaque for a retired dolphin that once found a mine faster than anything else on Earth. It's also a lesson written in procurement language. Match tools to tasks, price in the moral cost, and stop confusing clever with wise. When the next emergency hits, someone will propose an idea that sounds bold and living. The room will feel the old pull. The counterslide, showing a burnt hanger, a stray cat, a dolphin surfacing beside a plastic buoy, should be ready. That's the quiet part of the sunset, remembering why it's happening so you don't wake it again. Fear and secrecy turned living creatures into tools, and a few narrow wins couldn't justify the cost in suffering, risk, and distraction. If this kind of buried history intrigues you, subscribe and keep going. Our next episode dives into the strange experiments that bridged animal senses to modern drones. Watch it to see how today's autonomous systems carry echoes of these programs without the pens, the trainers, or the shadows that kept the truth out of sight.